All right, we continue to monitor today's major case at the Supreme Court. Justices are hearing arguments on the president's authority to impose tariffs on any international country. CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman is live outside of the Supreme Court and joins me now to talk about it. Katrina, all right, here's where we're looking. Catch us up. What have we learned so far?
Hi, Vlad. Well, first of all, I'm out in front of the Supreme Court, and there is a long line of people here who are waiting to get into these arguments. This is such a big case that it's really drawing a crowd. But so far, there has been a lot of pushback. John Sauer is arguing on behalf of the Trump administration right now, and he's arguing to a court of originalists, of textualists, of people who rely on statutory interpretation. And Vlad, they keep asking him about the way he's trying to use the language here to regulate importation. Justice Amy Coney Barrett.
Okay, so I need everyone to pay very close attention to what I am about to tell you, because the Supreme Court just did something that changes everything about how much power Donald Trump actually has as president of the United States. This is massive news. This is the kind of ruling that reshapes the entire relationship between the branches of government for decades to come. And honestly, I do not think most people understand just how significant this decision really is for Trump's agenda and for the future of the American presidency itself. The Supreme Court, and I want you to really hear this, the same court that conservatives have celebrated for years as finally being on their side, just handed Trump one of the most devastating legal defeats of his entire political career. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us. Be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
John Sauer has been arguing that the president has broad authority when it comes to foreign affairs, that he has the inherent power to regulate foreign commerce. He also said that these are regulatory tariffs. He said they're not revenue-raising tariffs. He said that that creates a distinction here, Vlad. So there's been a lot of pushback. They're also talking about the major questions doctrine quite a bit, which says you can't make rules on issues of vast economic or political significance unless Congress has specifically conferred that power. And then Sauer has also been hearkening back to a case related to Nixon. It was an earlier version of the law that IEPA now is, and Nixon had used that to invoke his ability to tax. And so the Trump administration is relying on that quite a bit, but the justices are really pushing back here.
Yeah, and so Katrina,
here is what happened and why it matters so much for the country going forward. The Supreme Court issued a surprise ruling that sharply limits President Trump's executive authority to impose sweeping trade tariffs using emergency powers. They looked at what Trump has been doing with tariffs, and they said, no, you cannot just do whatever you want on major economic policy without going through Congress first. This is a direct rebuke to Trump's entire governing philosophy. His whole approach has been built around the idea that he can use executive orders and emergency declarations to bypass Congress whenever he wants on any issue. The court is saying that is not how the Constitution works. There are limits to presidential power, even for Donald Trump. Now let me explain why this ruling is such a big deal in practical terms that affect real people. Trump has been using something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to justify imposing massive tariffs on imports from countries around the world, i.e. EPA for short. He claimed this was necessary for national security and economic emergency reasons. His administration projected that these tariffs would generate approximately $1.8 trillion in federal tax revenue over the next decade, from 2026 to 2035. That is trillion with a T. We are talking about a massive slice of the federal budget that Trump was counting on to fund his priorities without having to negotiate with Congress or make difficult budget trade-offs elsewhere. And now the Supreme Court has thrown all of that into serious legal jeopardy. Lower courts had already ruled against these tariffs, calling them unlawful overreach by the executive branch. A federal circuit court ruled against Trump. A Washington district court ruled against Trump. But those decisions were put on hold while the Supreme Court took up the case for expedited review because of the enormous stakes involved. Everyone expected the conservative majority on the court to side with Trump and restore his tariff authority. That is not what happened at all. Instead, the justices, including members of the conservative bloc that Trump supporters love, expressed deep concern over Trump's reliance on this vague federal law to implement sweeping global tariffs without any congressional approval whatsoever. The conservative justices questioned whether any president should have this kind of unchecked power to impose major economic measures that affect millions of Americans and billions of dollars in trade. Think about what that means for a moment. These are not liberal activist judges looking for ways to undermine Trump at every turn. These are the same conservative justices that Trump supporters have celebrated for years. These are originalists who believe in limited government and separation of powers as core constitutional principles. And they looked at what Trump was doing and said this goes too far, even for us. This is executive overreach that the Constitution does not permit, regardless of which party controls the White House. Justice Sotomayor issued a particularly stinging dissent that highlights just how significant this moment is for the balance of power in our government going forward. She warned that the court's overall approach to executive power, including letting presidents fire officials who enforce laws they do not like, hands the executive the power to essentially repeal statutes by firing everyone necessary to carry them out. She called the threat to our Constitution's separation of powers grave. She warned about the long-term implications for democratic governance if this trend continues unchecked. Now here is what makes this ruling so devastating for Trump, specifically, beyond just this one policy area. On tariffs, Trump has governed almost entirely through executive action. During his second term in office, he has used emergency declarations and executive orders to bypass Congress on immigration policy. He has used executive authority to make budget cuts without legislative approval from the House and Senate. He has fired agency heads who tried to enforce laws he disagreed with personally. His entire governing strategy has been built around maximizing presidential power and minimizing the role of Congress in policy-making decisions, and the Supreme Court just put up a giant stop sign right in the middle of that entire strategy. This ruling does not just affect tariffs and trade policy. It sends a powerful signal to lower courts across the country that Trump's expansive claims of executive authority are not going to be rubber-stamped by the judiciary anymore. It empowers Congress to push back against executive overreach, knowing the courts will back them up when disputes arise. It gives ammunition to everyone who has been arguing that Trump has gone too far in accumulating power in the executive branch. And it could reshape the entire narrative heading into the 2026 midterm elections as voters consider whether they want to give Republicans continued control of Congress or elect Democrats who will provide a check on presidential power. All right, so let us get into the specifics of what the Supreme Court actually decided and why this ruling represents such a significant shift in how courts are approaching Trump's claims of executive authority going forward. The details here matter a lot because this is not just about tariffs and trade policy. This is about fundamental questions of constitutional power that will affect every president who comes after Trump, regardless of which party they belong to. This ruling establishes precedent that will shape American government for decades. The core issue before the Supreme Court was whether President Trump had the legal authority to impose sweeping global tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act without specific authorization from Congress for this particular purpose. Trump's administration argued aggressively that IEEPA gives the president broad authority to regulate international economic transactions during declared emergencies. They claimed tariffs fall within that authority. They pointed to the vague language of the statute and argued it should be interpreted to give maximum flexibility to the executive branch to respond to economic threats facing the nation whenever the president deems it necessary. The challengers in this case, which included business groups and importers directly affected by the tariffs, argued that Congress never intended IEEPA to be used this way when they wrote the law decades ago. They said the law was designed for targeted sanctions against specific countries or entities during genuine emergencies. It was not designed for restructuring the entire global trading system through massive across-the-board tariffs affecting trillions of dollars in commerce. They argued that using IEEPA this way essentially allowed the president to make major tax policy unilaterally without the consent of Congress. And Congress has the constitutional power to regulate commerce and levy taxes, not the president acting alone. What made this case so significant was how the conservative justices responded during oral arguments on November 5th. These are justices who generally favor strong executive power in most circumstances. They have often sided with Republican presidents on questions of presidential authority throughout their careers. But during the arguments, they expressed serious concerns about the scope of power Trump was claiming in this case. They questioned whether any president should be able to impose economic measures this significant without explicit congressional approval first. They worried about the precedent this would set for future presidents of either party who might abuse the same authority. They invoked core conservative principles about limited government and separation of powers. This was absolutely not supposed to happen according to conventional political wisdom about how the Supreme Court operates in our era. Trump appointed 3 of the justices currently on the court during his first term. Conservatives have spent decades working to build a Supreme Court majority that would be friendly to their policy priorities on every issue. And yet, here were conservative justices openly questioning whether Trump had gone too far in his claims of executive authority on this major issue. This tells you something really important about how extreme Trump's legal position actually was in this case. It was so extreme that even judges, sympathetic to conservative causes, could not accept it without completely abandoning their stated principles about constitutional limits on government power. The lower court decisions that preceded this Supreme Court ruling are also important for understanding the legal landscape that brought us to this moment. The Federal Circuit Court had ruled against the tariffs, finding that Trump exceeded his statutory authority under IEEPA. A Washington District Court reached the exact same conclusion, calling the tariffs unlawful executive overreach. These were not close calls or narrow rulings on technical grounds. Multiple courts, staffed by different judges, looked at what Trump was doing and concluded unanimously that it violated the law. The Supreme Court expedited its review of the case because of the enormous economic stakes involved. But the outcome was consistent with what the lower courts had already determined after careful analysis. Now let us talk about the economic implications of this ruling, because they are staggering in scope and will affect ordinary Americans directly. The Trump administration projected that these tariffs would generate approximately $1.8 trillion in federal revenue over the decade from 2026 to 2035. That money was absolutely central to Trump's budget plans and his ability to fund his priorities without making painful cuts elsewhere or raising other taxes on American families. With the tariffs now in serious legal jeopardy, that entire revenue stream is at risk. Trump will either have to find other sources of revenue, which likely means either tax increases or spending cuts that will be politically unpopular with his base, or he will have to accept much larger budget deficits than he planned, which contradicts everything Republicans claim to stand for. The ruling also creates immediate uncertainty for businesses that have been trying to plan around the tariff regime Trump imposed over the past year. Companies that adjusted their supply chains or raised prices to account for tariffs now face serious questions about whether those tariffs will actually remain in effect going forward. Companies that held off on investments because of tariff uncertainty now have even more reason to wait and see what happens before committing capital. This kind of policy instability is terrible for economic planning at every level. It could dampen business investment and hiring at exactly the wrong time when the economy needs stability and predictability to grow. Industries that depend heavily on imports are particularly affected by this uncertainty created by the ruling. Manufacturing companies that import components from overseas face serious questions about their cost structures going forward. Retailers that import finished goods face questions about their pricing and profit margins. Agricultural exporters who have been hit by retaliatory tariffs from other countries in response to Trump's policies face questions about when those trade conflicts might finally end. The ripple effects of this ruling extend far beyond the immediate legal question about one statute to touch virtually every sector of the American economy in some way. The political implications are equally significant and could reshape the dynamics heading into the 2026 midterm elections in ways that favor Democrats. Trump has presented himself as a master deal maker who can use tariffs as leverage to get better trade agreements for America and bring jobs back. He has told his supporters that tariffs are bringing manufacturing jobs back to American communities and making other countries pay their fair share. This ruling completely undermines that entire narrative by establishing that Trump does not actually have the unilateral authority to impose tariffs the way he has been doing all along. He needs Congress to act first. And if Republicans in Congress are not willing to pass legislation specifically authorizing these tariffs, then Trump's entire trade agenda is essentially dead in the water. This ruling empowers Democrats and even some Republicans who have been skeptical of Trump's tariff strategy from the beginning. They can now point to the Supreme Court ruling and argue that Trump was acting illegally all along when he imposed these tariffs. They can demand that any future tariff policy go through the normal legislative process with public hearings and floor debates and recorded votes. They can position themselves as defenders of constitutional order against an executive branch that was grabbing power it did not legitimately have under the law. The ruling also fits into a broader pattern of legal setbacks Trump has faced in his efforts to expand presidential power during his second term. Courts have pushed back on immigration orders that exceeded statutory authority. Courts have questioned Trump's ability to make unilateral budget cuts without congressional approval. Courts have scrutinized his firing of agency officials who were supposed to have some independence from political pressure. Taken together, these rulings suggest the judiciary is not willing to simply defer to Trump's claims of executive authority the way his administration expected and planned for. Okay, so let us break this down into what it actually means going forward for Trump and for the country, because this ruling has implications that extend far beyond the immediate question of tariffs and trade policy. This is a pivotal moment for the balance of power in American government. The effects will ripple through our political system for years and decades to come, regardless of who occupies the White House. Point number one that everyone needs to understand about this ruling: this decision fundamentally constrains Trump's ability to govern through executive action, which has been the absolute cornerstone of his second-term strategy from day one. Trump came into his second term with an aggressive plan to use presidential power to implement his agenda without waiting for Congress to act on anything. He issued executive orders on immigration and trade and government reorganization. He declared emergencies to access funding and authorities that would otherwise require legislative approval from elected representatives. He fired officials who stood in his way or tried to enforce laws he disagreed with. The whole approach was built around maximizing executive power and treating Congress as an obstacle to be bypassed rather than a co-equal branch of government to be negotiated with in good faith. The Supreme Court just put a major check on that entire approach by ruling that there are constitutional limits the president cannot exceed even when claiming emergency authority to act. This is not a narrow technical ruling about one obscure statute that nobody cares about. This is a statement about the fundamental structure of American government and the separation of powers between the three branches. Future courts will cite this ruling when evaluating other claims of executive authority by future presidents. Agencies will be more cautious about implementing presidential directives that push legal boundaries. The whole calculus of what a president can do unilaterally has shifted in a significant way. Point number two that matters enormously for the economy and for ordinary Americans trying to plan their lives. The $1.8 trillion in projected tariff revenue that is now in legal jeopardy represents a massive fiscal hole that Trump will have to fill somehow if he wants to fund his priorities. That money was supposed to fund government operations and pay for Trump's agenda items over the next decade. Without it, Trump faces some very difficult choices that he did not want to make. He can try to find other revenue sources, which likely means tax increases that will be politically unpopular with his base. He can cut spending, which means reducing programs that ordinary people depend on. Or he can accept larger deficits, which completely contradicts Republican rhetoric about fiscal responsibility. The uncertainty this ruling creates is also terrible for business planning and economic growth across the country. Companies need to know what the rules are going to be in order to make investment decisions with confidence. When major policies, like tariffs, are in legal limbo, businesses hold back on hiring and capital expenditure until they know what the future looks like. This uncertainty functions like a tax on the economy, even if it does not show up in official government statistics. Every single day that tariff policy remains unsettled is a day that economic activity is being suppressed by policy uncertainty that did not need to exist. Point number three, about the political implications heading into the 2026 midterm elections. This ruling reshapes the narrative around Trump's presidency in ways that could matter significantly when voters go to the polls next year. Trump has presented himself as a strong leader who gets things done, while weak politicians talk endlessly without producing results. He has told his supporters repeatedly that he alone can fix the problems facing America because he is willing to use power aggressively, unlike career politicians. The Supreme Court ruling undermines that entire narrative by establishing that Trump's aggressive use of power was actually illegal overreach that the courts had to stop. Democrats now have a powerful argument to make to voters heading into the midterms. They can say Trump was not being strong. He was being lawless. They can say the Constitution matters and presidents cannot just do whatever they want, regardless of what Congress or the law says. They can position themselves as defenders of the rule of law against an administration that was grabbing unconstitutional power that did not belong to it. These arguments resonate with swing voters who may have supported Trump's policies in theory, but are uncomfortable with the idea of an unchecked executive branch that ignores legal limits. The ruling gives those voters permission to support Democrats as a check on presidential overreach without abandoning their other views. Point number four, about what this ruling means for the future of the presidency beyond Trump himself. This ruling will be cited for decades in cases involving executive authority and the limits of presidential power. Future presidents of both parties will have to contend with the precedent established here when they consider using emergency powers or executive orders to implement major policy changes without going through Congress. The ruling strengthens Congress relative to the executive branch by establishing clearly that the legislature's role in major policy decisions cannot simply be bypassed through creative statutory interpretation or emergency declarations. Some people will celebrate this as a victory for constitutional order and the separation of powers that the founders intended. Others will worry that it hamstrings future presidents from responding quickly to genuine emergencies that require fast action. Both perspectives have merit and deserve consideration. The question of how much power the president should have is one of the oldest debates in American politics, going back to the founding era. This ruling is just the latest chapter in that ongoing conversation about the proper balance between effective executive leadership and democratic accountability through the legislative process. What really strikes me about this moment is how it reveals the enduring strength of American constitutional institutions, even in our deeply polarized era. Trump has spent years attacking courts and judges who rule against him on anything. He has questioned the legitimacy of judicial review itself. He has suggested that presidents should not have to follow court orders they disagree with personally. But when the Supreme Court ruled against him on tariffs, his administration complied with the ruling. The legal system worked the way it is supposed to work. The checks and balances that the founders built into the Constitution functioned as intended to prevent the accumulation of excessive power in any one branch of government. That does not mean the system is perfect or that we can take it for granted going forward. The fact that this ruling was necessary shows how aggressively Trump pushed the boundaries of executive authority during his time in office. The fact that lower courts had to intervene shows how willing his administration was to test legal limits repeatedly. Maintaining constitutional order requires constant vigilance from citizens and a willingness to use the legal tools available to check executive overreach. This ruling is a reminder that those tools still work when people are willing to use them, but only if we remain vigilant. Here is what I want to leave you with today as you think about this ruling. The Supreme Court decision on tariffs is not just about trade policy or tax revenue or economic projections for the federal budget. It is about the fundamental question of how America is governed and who gets to make major decisions that affect millions of people. The founders created a system where power is divided among branches, specifically to prevent any one person or institution from becoming too powerful. Trump has spent his presidency testing the limits of that system. He has been pushing against the boundaries of executive authority constantly. The Supreme Court just pushed back in a significant and meaningful way. The question now is what happens next. Does Trump accept the ruling and work with Congress to pursue his policy goals through the normal legislative process? Does he look for other creative ways to achieve the same outcomes that might survive judicial scrutiny? Does he attack the court and the judges who ruled against him the way he has attacked every other institution that has checked his power? The answers to these questions will tell us a lot about where American democracy is headed and whether our constitutional system can continue to function in an era of intense polarization. All right, that is it for today, folks. This was a big one with major implications for the economy and for the balance of power in our government. Hit that subscribe button if you have not already. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this Supreme Court ruling. Do you think Trump will accept the limits the court has imposed on his power? Do you think this will change how he governs going forward? I want to hear your thoughts, and I will see you in the next one. Stay informed and stay engaged. This is history happening in real time. Peace.